Happy Monday to you. Hope you're having a nice sunny slash snowy slash insanely windy day. I'm kind of cold, so I'm bundled up in my sweatshirt here. Uh, can you continue reading on? We're almost done with this little book, Knowing Jesus by James Allison. And he has just finished talking about how one of the guarantees of knowing Jesus is that a person is more at home in the idea of being part of the rotten and corrupt mass of humanity, that we're not always on the lookout for someone else to blame. We're comfortable with being complicit in the faults and violences of the world and recognizing our own part in them instead of trying to shift the blame onto others. It would not be enough to see the crucified and risen one merely setting us free to belong to the world. There is more than that. Our desires that were formed in violence are transformed not by magic, but by a new sort of practical learning, which, like all our learning, works by imitation. We learn to imitate the self giving victim drawn on by the intelligence of the victim, which sets us free to act gratuitously, reveals to us our and other people's outcasts, the inconvenient ones, and empowers us to works of service, of solidarity with them, and so on. By concrete practical acts of relearning, which will at first strain against our old attitudes and patterns, we acquire new desires. And our whole person is formed by new desires, an imitation of the one in whose imitation there are no stumbling blocks, no rivalry. The other which forms us ceases to be the world with its violent, rivalistic desires by which we cause each other scandal, cause each other to stumble. Rather, the other which forms us becomes the spirit of the self giving victim. We become possessed by the crucified and risen one by a slow process of entrancement or possession, which has to pass through concrete acts of increasing freedom and service. That, I think, is what Paul means when he says, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." He was talking about the peaceful possession, which is the reforming of the whole of the person that is constituted by desire. He was talking about the fruition of the process constituted by progressive acts of imitation of this self giving one, inspired by the intelligence of the victim in Jesus. The concrete acts, the works of imitation, are exactly the way grace makes available to us the freedom which is possession by Christ. This is part of the package of knowing Jesus, being affected in this sort of way. If someone says that they know Jesus and this is not part of what they are talking about, then I would be suspicious. Please note again that what I am referring to, the Jesus who is known, the only Jesus that there is available to be known, is the crucified and risen victim. Simultaneously, his presence works this deep transformation of forgiveness and introduces us into the universal new Israel. These are not even separate acts. Our forgiveness, our healing, our conversion, the development of the new heart by concrete works of service and self-giving, the new patterns of relating, the dropping the need for self-justification, for identity by comparison, and the being inducted into the new Israel of God, the Catholic Church. All this is the same thing. Just as I have insisted that people who say they know Jesus but don't know or have no perception of these things may well be fooling themselves, so I think it is important to say that the many people who would be nervous of saying that they know Jesus and yet do know these things are aware of them as part of a slow, perhaps uneven experience, may well be fooling themselves. For to know these things is indeed to know the power and presence of the crucified and risen Jesus. So far, I've attempted to set out ways by which we can make sense of talk of knowing Jesus, derived from what we've gleaned about the Jesus who is to be known. Now, I propose to be a bit less indirect in my approach by looking at some existing models of knowing Jesus and comparing them with what Jesus himself has to say about such things from the Gospel of John. Throughout this book, I've been trying to emphasize that talk of knowing Jesus has its proper place in the language of faith. I've been trying to indicate all sorts of ways of knowing, of awareness and perception, which might not strike you straight away as having to do with knowing. What I like to do is take the sort of knowing that I've been discussing and knowing that has objective, public consequences and that produces changes in relationships over time and over a whole range of feelings, and to compare that with some ways of talking which suggests that knowing Jesus is like knowing a secret friend. You are probably aware that I am of the existence of what one might call an intimist spirituality. I've borrowed the word from Spanish intimista. It is a way of being spiritual that is greatly to do with personal feelings. Now, in this way of thinking, knowing Jesus might be a strong personal experience that can't really be explained to other people. It might be a sudden intensification of religious feeling that seems to make a unitary sense of that person's life. There are any number of possible experiences of this sort that might be thought by the one experiencing them to be experiences of knowing Jesus. Now, from what I've been saying thus far, you can probably guess where I'm going here. Does the recipient of the experience consider him or herself to have been set apart from others by it? Because if they do, then one wonders how this can be an experience of the crucified and risen Lord. An experience of the crucified and risen one brings a person to be more, not less common, more, not less inclined to love the human race, and acknowledge his or her dependence on it. It inclines a person to be less inclined to judge and to consider themselves separate from others. The reason I stress this is because there are some teachings around which make a certain sort of experience the criterion for being a real Christian. The experience is made into a real divider, a stumbling block. This has nefarious consequences. One is that the person in question thinks that they have made it. They are saved, or whatever the language they care to use is. That is a terrible mistake, because they have made of a single or a series of experiences a substitute for a relationship, working over a long period of time, inducing profound changes in that person's life. The only way to test out the health of the relationship is to look not at feelings, but at the patterns of relating with concrete others, and particularly with the sort of concrete others with whom Jesus identified himself: the poor, the naked, the imprisoned, the sick, and on and on. A private experience called knowing Jesus can never be a substitute for a public change in ways of relating, within the public framework by which Jesus makes himself to be known, the sacraments and victims. The person who really thinks that a private experience of knowing Jesus is what will stand him or her in good stead at the last judgment must prepare for the shock that on that day the one they claim to have known may turn and say to them, "I tell you, I do not know you." There's nothing subjective about the criteria set out in Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats. The second nefarious consequence is on the person who doesn't have such an experience, but is yet a believer, perhaps a believer who has great difficulties in whole areas of his or her life. For this person, the insistence on an intimate experience of knowing Jesus can be a crushing burden. It can further and deepen this person's sense that they are not really lovable, and they're not really up to it as a Christian. Other people seem to have this marvelous experience and talk radiantly about Jesus or speak in tongues or whatever, but this person stumbles along feeling somehow left out by God. Well, of course, it's a lie that the person is left out by God, and it's certainly true that God longs for that person to be able to love him or herself, to have a higher self-esteem so as better to be able to love others. It may indeed be true that genuine and wonderful feelings are in store for that person, but they'll never find that out while they are caused to stumble by the insistence on certain sorts of feelings. Rather, they'll continue to be locked into a certain sort of jealousy, whereby they either see themselves as or are made to feel to be second-class Christians, by comparison with the ones who have had the experience. Now, there's only one way out of that, which is by stepping outside the whole field of tension surrounding personal experiences, learning to stop comparing themselves with others, and relaxing instead into the public ways in which the crucified and risen Jesus makes himself present and shows them his love. They will have to learn how to renounce the desire for experience or experiences, as they discover that those very desires, spiritual seeming as they are are riddled with envy and rivalry. It is towards helping that happen that this book has been aimed.
Christ is alive, let Christians sing. The cross stands empty to the sky. Let streets and homes with praises ring. Love drowned in death shall never die. Christ is alive, no longer bound to distant years in Palestine, but saving, healing here and now, and touching every place and time. In every inn, song, lift, and war, where colors scorn or wealth divide, Christ suffers still, yet loves some more, and lives where even hope has died. Women and men, in age and youth, can feel the Spirit, hear the call, and find the way, the life, the truth, revealed in Jesus, free for all. Christ is alive and comes to bring good news to this and every age, till earth and sky and ocean ring with joy, with justice, love, and praise.
Good day to you.